Hi, welcome to my video about answering AO3 questions. So I think sometimes students find AO3 evaluation essays intimidating. So I want to show you some tips on how to revise and how to answer AO3 evaluative essays. So what is it that you have to do? You have 30 minutes to achieve 25 marks. Those are split into two different assessment objectives. So AO1 is for your knowledge and understanding of the chosen topic, and 15 marks are available for your AO3, which is evaluation of the chosen topic. Now, we like to call this no escape essays because no matter which AO2 scenarios you choose to answer in the exam, everybody must answer the same evaluative essay. However, remember, it's only worth 25% of your overall marks, so it's nothing to get worried about. It just means you need to know your AO1 well. So how do we do that? How do we achieve highly on AO1? First off, your AO1 should be a clear, comprehensive summary of the topic that anybody, like your gran or your dog, could read and understand. To be able to do this, I would recommend practicing writing down top 10 key words that help you remember the different key rules and principles of that topic. And we have some pointers for this in the Newcastle 6-1 College Law Teams Files folder. This should also be supplemented with cases or examples of acts. And a lot of people ask how many cases they should include, and this doesn't have an easy answer. The answer will vary depending on whether it's a very case law heavy area or whether it's more statute led, and it also depends on how many cases other students are writing in there. So for example, if you put 4 cases in but everyone else is writing 7, those answers are going to look stronger. So as a starting point, I would suggest that you have at least 3 cases in there, and then try and build from there. So a good tip is to set a timer for about 10 minutes, which is what I'd recommend that you spend on AO1, and then simply go through and try and write as much as you can down in 10 minutes. How many cases can you include? How much can you write in 10 minutes? Now, a good starting point is always a definition. So the first sentence of your essay should start something like voluntary manslaughter is, exclusion clauses are. It should look something like that. Then focus on the basics, getting your AO1 down first, leaving you time to focus on AO3 later. So your essay should look a little bit like this, and feel free to use headings to show the examiner what they're reading. So your AO1 should all be written down first, then your AO3 finished by a conclusion. Now, why write it in this way? Well, first off, it means that you are getting all of the AO1 in. Now, if you can get 10 marks out of 10 for the AO1 alone, that should give you at least a D or thereabouts. Now, that's much better than getting a U, which is what happens if people don't write anything for these essays because they're too scared by them. So at least if you can get a D, you can then start building on that grade with the AO3 you add in. So at least if you write the AO1, that's something. And that should be easy to do if you revise it throughout. That also gives you thinking time. So as you're writing out your AO1, hopefully you know this like the back of your hand at this point for the exams. As you're writing out the AO1, you can be thinking about some AO3 arguments you would like to discuss later, and then refer back to the AO1 almost as a checklist for your AO3. So for everything you've written up here, have you evaluated it down here? Now, what topics do you have to get to grips with? As I said, there is no choice in the exam. You must answer the question in front of you. However, according to the OCR specification, there are only certain topics that you have to evaluate, and I've tried to write them down here for each of your 3 papers. Now, you'll notice actually that not all of the topics are here. So for example, in torts, you don't have to evaluate the defences or the remedies, so things like compensation. For criminal law, you don't have to evaluate the essential elements of actus reus and mens rea, although of course you do still need to understand those to be able to answer AO2 scenarios properly. In contract law, the evaluation really focuses on how a contract is formed and what it includes, so making a contract. So offer and acceptance, types of terms, There isn't any evaluation to do on discharging contracts, so topics like misrepresentation or frustration. What you need to do, therefore, in your revision is try and write 10 points of all of these topics. Try and learn them off the back of your hand with case examples to give you that foundation. And we have lists of these topics and the key points in the NSFC Law Teams folder. Once you know these and you're confident with your knowledge, you can start evaluating. So what do we do for that? Well, remember, this is the meaty part of your essay because it's worth 15 out of 25 marks. So it needs to be more of the focus of your exam question. The way that we mark it as examiners is that we are looking for extended points. So your exam might look a bit like this. P means you've made a point. D means you've got a developed point. E means you have extended your point. How do we do that? Stick to this 3 simple sentence structure and you should do well. So first off, state a point. Based on the theme of the question, make a statement. Now it could be a benefit, a drawback, an advantage, a disadvantage, a pro, con, whatever the question is asking you. So for example, if the question was on non-fatal offences, I might say something like, one advantage of GBH is that there are 2 separate offences depending on the mens rea of the defendant. I've simply stated a point. Then I'm going to improve on that by developing it. And this is done by explaining why it is good, bad, whatever. Good way to start your sentence here is this is because that forces you to explain your reasoning. This is because the 2 different sentences reflect the different mens rea of the defendant, whether they were actually intending to do serious harm or it happened almost as a byproduct. Those 2 different mindsets clearly need to be treated differently. Finally, to get into the high levels, you must extend your points further. Key point to note here is that it must link back to what you've already written. If it's an argument that has nothing to do with anything, it will be a new separate point. So it must link in. Now, good words to use here are however. I love seeing that word in the exam because that's a clear indication that you're trying to extend, or maybe words like furthermore. So here you would bring up things like counter arguments, especially if you're using however. It could be supporting case examples or acts that back up your reasoning, or it could even be suggestions for reforms, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. However, they must be linked. So I might say something like, however, the downside of having 2 different GBH offences is that the sentences are so different for them. So section 20 has a maximum 5 years, and then section 18 jumps to discretionary life. That is a big gap, and the Law Commission has suggested we reform this by changing the sentences. So I've actually managed to do both. I've managed to give a counter and an extension by talking about reforms, and that's how you get the high levels. So whenever you're writing, try to have these 3 sentence starters. Something is good. This is because, however. Now, it's a really good thing when you're practicing to highlight or underline your AO3, especially if you're mixing it in with AO1. This shows it very clearly to the examiner or the teacher marking your work, but also it means you're checking that on balance you have slightly more AO3 than AO1. How do you get really good AO3? How do you get that level 4 excellent AO3? Well, I've just got a few things for you to bear in mind. First, stay focused on the theme in question. So is it about fairness? Is it about justice? Is it about being too precedent-led? Now, you can't really predict these themes very easily. Some are more generic, like those, but a practice exam question was, does Rylands versus Fletcher still play a part in protecting the environment? That's a very specific theme to that question. Now, weaker students, when they panic in the exam, can sometimes just start talking about whether the law is fair or unfair all the time, but that's not actually answering the question being given. Try and argue evenly. So try and maintain some balance throughout your essay. It's all right for it to be a little bit on one side, but try and stay focused, because that's going to give you those however extension points in the exam. The level 4 talks about a wide-ranging discussion, and what that means is you need a wide range or a number of different arguments. Your argument shouldn't always come back to the same thing. So for example, in vicarious liability, answers often come back to, well, the claimant, has been badly done to, so they should get compensation. Don't keep repeating the same thing. You need lots of different points for a wide-ranging argument. Reforms are a really good way of giving some variety in your answer as well. You'll come across a lot of suggestions for change or reform in the law. For example, the Law Commission has suggested quite a few things about manslaughter that you might want to refer to, or we often talk about comparisons to other countries. So for example, you might talk about the American homicide system, or we often compare the sort of no-fault systems of liability for negligence in Canada or New Zealand. And these are referred to throughout your NSFC handouts. You must also have a valid conclusion for anything above level 2. So a valid conclusion, often a good way of doing it is giving some starting words like in conclusion, to conclude, make really clear that's what you want to do. And then a valid conclusion should have 3 sentences or thereabouts. Give one side of the argument, so give the strongest argument out of all you've written. And this is a really good opportunity to refer back to the question and pull out words from the question to incorporate into your answer. Then give the other side, give your strongest argument against. Then overall, I think. You must make a conclusion for it to be a valid conclusion, but as long as you've stated both sides, it doesn't really matter which one you've chosen. The examiner is more interested in how you've laid out your argument rather than the finale of the argument itself. Now, if you're writing your conclusion and you suddenly think of a really good argument that you've not already included, feel free to include it in your conclusion. It's not ideal. Ideally, the conclusion would just be a summary of what's already said, which is why it should be short but valid, but it's better than leaving out information altogether. So how do we practice and how do we get our AO3 better? Now, it's hard to predict what the AO3 is going to be about in the exam. So I think it's a waste of time trying to practice AO3 writing in full. You can't possibly predict what the topic or what the theme is going to be. So what we instead need to do is practice the skill of thinking about AO3. And we can do that in a really easy way. So first off, what you need to do is make 2 piles of paper. One, a pile of all the different topics you have to cover, which was on the previous board, and another, a list of potential themes that could come up in the exam. Now this is endless, but we can think of some that might crop up in some form. And again, there are lists in the NSFC Law Teams file that you can see some suggestions we've come up with. Make 2 piles or put them in 2 separate containers. Then to practice, you need to think of things at random, and this is where knowing your AO1 is really helpful. The better you know your AO1, the better you are going to be able to understand an exam. You know it better, you critique it better. So for example, I've picked out gross negligence manslaughter and whether it deters wrongdoing. So a question might be, discuss the extent to which the laws of gross negligence manslaughter deter wrongdoing. So there's no way I could predict that sort of question coming up, but now that it's come up at random, I need to think of a reason for and a reason against. And what you can do is you can write it down on a bit of paper using this easy table. So the topic you've picked randomly, the theme you've picked randomly, and then the smiley positive face is an agreement. Give me an example or reasoning where you would agree, and then the negative frowny face is where you would disagree or counter that argument. So for example, I might say that gross negligence manslaughter does deter wrongdoing because it stops people getting away with making simple mistakes in simple procedures. So for example, if you think of R versus Adamaco, that was a very simple thing he had to do, check the patient's breathing tube was still connected, and it took him 9 minutes to notice it had been disconnected. So By prosecuting him, as well as suing him in civil law, by prosecuting him, that deters wrongdoing because people will want to avoid going to prison for simple mistakes that could have been easily avoided. However, that key bridging word, however, it does not deter wrongdoing because the definition of gross is very vague. It's down to the individual jury, and different juries may come up with different interpretations. Therefore, it might create a loophole, and this won't deter wrongdoing if defendants think they might get away with a loophole in the law. The more you know the AO1, the more you are able to think of examples like that on the spot. And I've just written on the board here some other examples of questions that you may come up with. So, is the law on murder clear? Is the laws of vicarious liability just? Are the laws on consumer rights reasonable? And just try and think of an example why you would agree and an example why you would disagree. So for example, for murder, is it clear? Well, some terms are clear. Human being, there's a lot of work being put into clarifying that. However, there are some terms that are arguably still not very clear, such as malice aforethought. Or, with vicarious liability, it's just that the claimant gets compensated because they're an innocent victim. However, it's not always just because the defendant can't control all staff. And I think Mohammed versus Morrison's is a really good example of what more could Morrison's have done. Are consumer rights reasonable? Well, yes, because they protect weaker consumers who can't often bargain with a retailer. However, the rules aren't always very clear. So what is considered to be satisfactory isn't always reasonable depending on the product that we're looking at. The more you do this, the more you get into that mindset of being able to objectively write a rule and then evaluate the pros and cons, the reasons you would agree or disagree with a question. And even better if you can do this with a friends or a study group. So simply lay out the format. One person chooses the topic and theme at random. The rest have to write for and against. Have a little debate about it. And then the person who picks the topics decide which side was strongest, and make a note of your arguments as well. But the more you practice the skill, you don't need to write essays and essays and essays. Just get your brain used to that exercise of how to think about the pros and cons of the information that you're able to talk about in the exam. Thank you for watching.